Hey everyone, today we're bringing a new story for you. Well, this is quite a peculiar work. In this story, we follow a protagonist who was ambushed by some powerful monsters. In the end, he was killed, but he got the chance from the system to come back to life. He could return, but also gained new things, like a Necromancer ability, which allows him to revive anyone with a shadow. Similar to a certain character, he ends up doing the same thing, raising the dead to fight and managing to take on powerful monsters alone or alongside his friend. But to truly understand this whole story, we need to go back to the beginning, to a dungeon. Then we observe a completely battered boy. He and his ally are in a very precarious situation, as he now finds himself faced with both light and darkness. For some reason, both are allied, and at this moment, he finds himself before the goddess of light and the demon king. At this point, he wonders why this demon king was allied with her. She then says that humans had no chance of defeating them, so it was better in the end to ally with them. However, our hero gets angry at this, yelling at her, calling her a loser for betraying humanity. But now, the Demon King says that this guy talks too much and will end him now. At this moment, he raises his finger, causing our protagonist to move upwards into the air. He is then compressed to a certain point, compressed to the extent that he ends up, let's say, exploding. At this point, he couldn't bear it and ended up dying. When he went to the afterlife, that dear system appeared, saying that he ended up obtaining the Demon Lord system. Not understanding, he asks what was happening but wakes up in another place, a sanctuary of demons. Yan Yong then opens his eyes and realizes he is in a completely unknown place. Beside him, there are several coffins, but he doesn't pay much attention to them because, looking to the side, he notices the system screen telling him he has now become the Demon Lord. With this title, he can summon some demons and at the same time turn some into something else. But he feels sad about this because he was always trying to fight against it. Yet now he has become what he fought. However, stopping to think, this power wouldn't be so bad, since he could use it to take revenge on that angel who betrayed him to side with the Demon King. With this power now in his hands, he is confident that he can take revenge. Yes, he needs to become stronger, and he will become the Demon Lord. At the moment he accepts this, he moves forward. The system asks him to stand in the center of the altar. At the moment he steps into the center, a lightning bolt strikes one of the coffins in front of him. At this point, things start to get more intense, and all that energy flows into our protagonist. Now, looking at the Angel of Light, he promises that she will wait for him because he will definitely go there to take his revenge. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to another place, a mountain where we see someone mourning a certain friend. This is our hero. But here he is sad because he essentially left his friend behind. Here we are introduced to him, a level 2 adventurer named Tung Jing. While he is standing there thinking about what to do with his life, he hears a voice asking why he would do such a thing. If he wanted to bury him, he could do it with a stone. He gets confused and turns around to find our hero alive and well. At this point, his jaw drops. How is this possible? He's alive! He starts crying, then gets angry because he spent 5 years coming to this place to visit him. But our hero doesn't care much about this, as he realizes his friend is still at level 2. Then they grab a motorcycle and start riding down the mountain until they see a statue of an angel. At this point, they ask what it is. His friend answers, saying that the angel fought against some demons and in the end, defeated them all. As gratitude, a statue was built in her honor. He thinks it's a farce, so the protagonist tells his friend the whole truth, who now believes what that angel was really about. But now that he's back, his friend wants to take him to a new restaurant that just opened. However, our hero refuses, saying he has to go home to grab some clothes, as he'll be waiting for his friend at the dungeon's entrance. His friend is upset because it would have been cheaper to go to the restaurant than the dungeon. The dungeon now requires payment for entry, which annoys our protagonist. Looking at the paper in his hand, he sees that a level 1 dungeon costs 10,000 coins and an 80% commission fee. His friend, nicknamed Melon Head, says it's not strange, as this has been happening for 5 years now. At this moment, annoyed, Melonhead grabs him by the collar and pulls him back. He asks Yongqing to calm down a bit, because the opponent has many allies on his side to fight. After a while, he starts telling the story of how, thousands of years ago, a battle between humans and the undead took place. But one day, an archmage named Layla sealed the entrance to one of the dungeons, giving humanity a bit of peace. However, over time, the seals on those dungeons weakened, allowing the monsters inside to come out. Chaos erupted in humanity until the adventurers emerged, where Lise fought against monsters. But in one of those adventures, his group appeared, his friend here, and he ended up commenting that in this dungeon he almost died. But then they enter a dungeon, and inside, he comments that now you need to pay 80% to enter. It was good because after the Goddess of Light had destroyed 100% of certain demons, the best dungeons were no longer considered something dangerous or something that, in the end, brought problems. So, these people who are interested in charging anything for entering decided to choose the dungeons to charge anyone who wanted to go in. At this moment, he also thanks his friend for paying to enter the dungeon, but he gets confused because he was being thanked even though he always treated them like the poor ones. Ignoring this, he ends up wondering why his friend dragged him into this dungeon. Then, his friend says he will need his help since he needs him to go to a certain place to find a strong opponent. His goal is to kill him to turn him into his shadow. But now they don't have time to talk, because a strong monster is heading in their direction, and at this moment, a scorpion appears. His friend, seeing the scorpion, asks him to stay there and watch his show. As he says this, his friend starts running toward the scorpion. When he gets close, the scorpion attacks, but he uses his shield to defend himself and then goes underneath, where he manages to cut the underside of the scorpion, defeating it. Watching from afar, our protagonist realizes that Jig Fun, his friend, is a human shield. But despite his fight being basically successful, he is still quite weak. He needs to level up a lot to reach a high enough level. At this point, our protagonist shouts for his friend to go ahead and kill more monsters, because with that, he could level up more. And so he obeys, going and killing one by one of these scorpions that were around. After a long time, all that's left are the carcasses of the creatures lying on the ground. After some time, our hero finally reaches level 2 alongside his friend. His friend already celebrates, saying he wasn't so bad after all. Then a screen appears, showing the status of Wang Wang, his friend. At the moment, he hadn't achieved much, but at this point, he's showing his friend something quite interesting. Clearly curious, his friend wonders what it is. At that moment, he already knew what ability he had. The scene cuts to our hero, who then commands the fallen creatures to rise and follow his orders. At this moment, a ray moves toward the carcasses of the scorpions on the ground. Minutes later, they rise. His friend, seeing this from our protagonist, is speechless. Minutes later, 2 scorpions appear, now under our protagonist's control. And now, when the hero sees these monsters transformed into human form, he is surprised to see that the transformation took on a human shape as well. But in the end, for him, this ability became so cool. Now he orders his pets to go ahead and kill all the monsters around. And as he commanded, they begin running and killing one by one. As they advanced, he noticed that the monsters being defeated were of the same level, but the summoned monsters were managing to defeat them very easily. His friend doesn't even pay attention to this, and instead focuses on another thing. These monsters could stay in the dungeon at a great distance, meaning he could be in bed, and his monsters would still be farming for him in the dungeon. After saying this, they ask our protagonist if, with these words, he didn't become a super genius. When he consulted the system, of course, our hero thought the same thing. However, that didn't happen because, for now, dungeons needed an adventurer inside them. But at the moment, he doesn't care much about that because now his goal is to go deeper into the dungeon to kill the Tail King, one of the powerful monsters inside. But while talking about this, something comes toward them. They look ahead to see what it is and realize it's Coco, one of the monsters our protagonist controls. Coco apologizes because he didn't notice the presence of the Tail King. His friend is left speechless, seeing how such a strong monster was defeated so easily by the Tail King. After hearing the apology, he says it's fine, as the monsters were only level 1, and it was very unlikely they'd be able to defeat the boss, the Tail King. So they advance and eventually reach the boss. The Tail King turns out to be a bit stronger than they had imagined. His friend, with courage, asks our hero to stay behind because he wanted to handle things personally. Our protagonist, knowing that this monster was powerful, asks him to step back instead. He wanted to test some new things, and besides, his friend wasn't a match for this boss. He needed to trust him to defeat the boss easily. At that moment, he wants to draw the boss's attention solely to himself. So, he points his finger and calls out to it, making the boss irritated. Now that he got what he wanted, he asks his friend to act the same way he was acting. Then he starts running to one side, and his friend starts running too. To another, and at this moment, the boss chose a certain person, our protagonist, to chase. At this point, he almost managed to catch our hero, but before he could grab him, he ended up activating a magical eye. Then he shouted for his friend Jing Feng to finish him off. At this moment, from behind, he began running as fast as he could. Minutes later, he found the weak spot of this monster, this boss. Finding the weak spot, he took his sword and pierced it inside. The boss, feeling the power of that sword, screamed in pain. At that moment, knowing he was about to be killed, he jumped down. But because he jumped down, the ground completely cracked. At this moment, both looked inside and realized they had caused significant damage. However, the thing they wanted to achieve, killing the boss, was still not accomplished. To defeat him, they needed to get past the thick armor the boss had. But our protagonist had a plan for this. His plan was to draw the boss's attention and then immobilize him. Once that was done, he asked his friend to finish off the boss as quickly as possible. Our protagonist suspected the boss would appear behind him to catch him, as his intuition was a bit unique. He then just asked his friend to stand firm, holding his sword. As soon as he could, he might first take a photo and not worry about him because he would be completely fine. So following this crazy idea, he ended up executing his plan. It happened as he predicted. The boss then appeared behind him, and at this moment, we see the protagonist's friend extending his sword toward the monster. By doing something like that, he managed to stab another weak spot of the monster, injuring it. But not even that was perhaps enough to stop this monster. The boss then used another of its paws to try to deliver a blow to his friend. Smartly, his friend used his shield to defend himself. Looking forward, he noticed the claw near his eye. But looking to the other side, he noticed our hero. He commented that he could hold off this monster for a certain amount of time, so the protagonist needed to act quickly. After hearing this, he flew toward the monster, holding his sword, which was still stuck in it. Grabbing the sword and running, he began slicing the monster from the inside out. He managed to make a great cut in it. In the end, he successfully defeated the monster. After defeating this monster, he ended up gaining some abilities and additional items in his stats. Moreover, he also obtained a shield and a dagger, both very powerful. Now that the boss was defeated, he saw the drops were good and understood why they chose this dungeon as the first one to enter. Our hero only commented that he had seen this type of boss in other dungeons, those high-level dungeons, so he thought that even low-level dungeons might have similar bosses. Now, he displayed the shield and the dagger. He wondered which of the two he should pick. He chose the shield. Meanwhile, his friend decided to pick the dagger, which left him confused since he had never used one before. But he revealed that he had some spare time and had trained with it a bit. At this moment, they began thinking that, with the profit they made here, they could pay off all their debts. Then the scene cuts to the place where they meet the Melon Head. The Melon Head charged almost 80% for letting them enter the dungeon. Now, he wanted to charge even more because of the food they had delivered to him. He also started demanding other things, like experience points they gained from killing any monster. Growing increasingly irritated, the protagonist listened to the Melon Head's words. He wanted to lash out at him, but his friend stopped him. Furious, he began to pull his sword out but then stopped. He asked the Melon Head to leave. He also moved to another place where he noticed the presence of some level 1 bandits. Realizing he couldn't fight them now, he withdrew. But before leaving, the melonhead said that the protagonist had hurt his dear heart, Zoe. Now, realizing they had a very interesting shield, the melonhead demanded that they hand it over as a form of payment for the fee. Our hero walked away and asked his friend to give the shield to the melonhead, saying he would recover the shield and everything else the melonhead had taken anyway. Night fell, and the scene cut to the place where those bandits were. They were watching the news. On the news, there was a report about adventurers disappearing inside the dungeon. Then the bandits asked the adventurers. They were careful in the demise of the dungeon they were entering while they kept commenting about it. Rodo kept talking about some boss of his. However, out of nowhere, they began to feel a chilling breeze coming from below. And down there we could see someone, a melon-headed figure eating something uninteresting. The scene then shifts to outside this house, where we find two assassins who notice something strange happening. At first, they ignore it since they are basically in the desert, and nothing usually happens in the desert. But then, looking ahead, we notice that the boss's car had a rock in front of it that had fallen out of nowhere. Behind him, our hero appears. However, the scene cuts to inside the house, where we find the guy who was outside. He enters, but looks a little dizzy. His companions ask him what was happening with him, and as they take a closer look, they see that something bad had happened. At that moment, something jumps from behind him. Both of them look up but have no time to react because our protagonist jumps and strikes his head directly, pushing that adventurer backward. The other one, who was beside him, tried to use fire magic to hit our hero, but it was useless. With his speed, he easily dodged the first attack and started running toward him. Moments later, we see him making a slash, cutting that guy in half. Now that everyone was defeated, one still remained. They ask why he was doing this, but now he uses his magic eye, which does something as he runs toward this guy. The man doesn't understand what was happening. He only feels immense fear, so he just sits down. Meanwhile, our hero moves forward. Before entering inside, he notices a very cold atmosphere but cannot stay behind. He opens the door, and at that moment, he is surprised to find several adventurers in a dire situation. He realizes that the missing adventurers were right there, and the melon-headed figure was devouring them. But now that he was in this room, he would be the next to be devoured. Even more so as an adventurer who was merely level 2. His end would be here. But upon hearing this, he simply starts laughing out of nowhere. Then, he invites the figure to a good fight, commenting that he would join this fight. After all, he was in the mood to make a dessert, and the protagonist appeared at the perfect moment for him. The melon-headed figure then starts the fight, launching a fire beam toward him. But our hero dodges to the side, leaving the figure quite surprised and confused about what he was doing, until he sees him in front of him with a dagger in hand. The protagonist manages to land some slashes. However, at that moment, he notices something strange. The figure's level and speed didn't match what he had seen before. He sees the sword coming close to him. At that moment, the boy appears in front of him and finds it interesting to see that he can use fire magic and levitate. Now, he wants to make him one of his servants. But the figure, seeing himself in this situation, dislikes it and asks him to stop. Suddenly, something appears in his mouth, leaving him quite surprised. At that moment, an explosion occurs in the middle of the moon. We then observe the appearance of something mysterious. Only later do we reveal that this monster that appeared before him was a level 2 demon. At that moment, the figure is shocked to see that the chubby guy from earlier had basically found a strong opponent. But he wasn't someone of level 2. He thought about going back to that body until he looked to the side and noticed that only ashes of the chubby guy remained. He thought about going back to that body until he looked to the side and noticed that only ashes of the chubby guy remain. Finding this boring, he now realizes he needs to find another host. Looking to the side, our protagonist uses his skill in his direction, trying to catch this monster off guard. But no, he doesn't manage to. The monster's speed was much higher than our hero's movement. His speed was so high that he couldn't even clearly see him in front of him. He could only feel him. At that moment, something came in that direction. Seeing this, he jumped upward, and as he jumped, he was surprised to see that there was a hole in the ground. He realized it wasn't just fire, a fire that burned the ground instantly, as expected of an elite level 2 spell. Low-level people like him entering this second floor would likely have trouble facing a monster like this. Moreover, he notices that the space was too tight, giving a fire user like him complete advantage in this situation. So, he needs to lure him to another safer place. Running, we see him being chased. The monster yells that running to an open area or forest won't change anything. His fire was different. At this moment, the monster uses a fire skill aimed in his direction, but the protagonist keeps running, dodging through the forest. As he continues dodging, he eventually disappears, leaving the figure quite surprised. He asks where that guy went. He looks up and sees him above. The protagonist slashes downward, nearly hitting him, but the monster quickly dodges the attack. Even so, the protagonist manages to land a blow on the monster, leaving him very angry. The monster prepares fire in his hand to hit our protagonist directly. But before he can land the blow, our hero dodges at the last second. Grabbing part of the monster's clothing, he uses it as a way to escape faster, which ultimately works, leaving the monster increasingly enraged. He starts running faster toward our hero. Our protagonist also begins to run, and both meet in the middle of the forest. Upon meeting, the monster uses his fire to try to hit our protagonist, but the most he can do is hit some trees. As the protagonist runs, we see the destruction left behind. Continuing, he reaches a point where he cannot escape any further. Cornered here now, we observe a monster appearing behind our protagonist. Now that he's walked into a dead end, he wonders what he'll do to escape. The monster wants to see where he'll hide from his fire skill, which he launches in his direction. That fire heads toward our hero, devastating everything in its path. Everything is destroyed, including the mountain nearby, which ends up split in half. Everything turns to dust. The monster feels sad about this because that guy had seemed quite interesting to be his host. The last one he chose was a chubby guy who had a lot of diabetes, and among other diseases, he had a lot of difficulty staying in that body. Now he said no more chubby guys. Now he's going after those with bigger muscles and good health. At this moment, as he thinks about leaving, he feels a tremor. Then he looks down. He notices a crack. From that crack, something emerges that grabs him, immobilizing him. In this situation, he asks to wait a moment since that human should have been mere dust by now. Then he looks to the other side and notices a hole, and it's through there that he manages to escape. So far, it made him think he had won this fight, but at this moment, irritated, he comments that not even what just happened to him would be enough to stop him. Then he starts using his firepower again. But at that moment, a chain appears and moves toward his neck. Looking ahead, he finds our hero, who tells him to stop moving. An enormous pressure emanates from him, leaving him completely still and frightened. At this moment, he asks his tamed pet to release the guy. The pet obeys, and as soon as he's released, he stays quiet. But our hero demands that he hand over all the resources he had acquired earlier. The monster simply obeys, handing over the shield and other interesting weapons, as well as a massive collection of gold he had hoarded before. At this moment, he handed over everything that chubby guy had, the gold and the resources he had taken from our protagonist as well. But if he wanted more, he just needed to go to the guild since all the best things had been stored there. Looking at those gold bars, he realizes that selling them would fetch him 10 million on. This was surprising, seeing that guy managed to get all of that in a low-rank dungeon. However, focusing too much on what was beneath him, he lost all concentration, and the chain ended up breaking. The system appears, saying that danger was nearby and that it was better for him to hide. At this moment, the monster activates its fire ability and launches it toward our hero. But before it could hit him, he ducks. Right after ducking, he grabs the sword he got from the system, and with that, he finishes off the monster. In the end, he manages to defeat this level 2 demon, gaining XP and reaching level 2 as well. Upon reaching level 3, the system appears again, saying he could now enter any dungeon. However, upon entering a dungeon, monsters could also join, and they would fight for him. The XP gained would be distributed 100% to our protagonist, but this doesn't even catch his attention. Instead, it's the thing lying on the ground. He orders the thing to get up and follow his commands. At this moment, he gains 3 summons, but now he only has space for 2. Looking at his level, he realizes the summoned creature's level matches his own, so he doesn't need to train the monster from scratch. But the monster immediately asks for its first orders, wanting to know what it should do to fulfill its mission. At this moment, he knew that today's dungeons were all monopolized by some irregular guilds. So he looked for dungeons those guilds hadn't discovered yet. He knew the creature beside him was a monster, so he wondered if a monster like that could reveal where its companions were. If it did, it would be better to take him there since he could level up a lot and become much stronger. But here, the scene shifts to another location. Someone arrives at our hero's friend's house. It's a delivery person. They hand him a package, but he wonders about it because he wasn't expecting anything. So he takes it inside, where he notices it's heavy. At first, he even thinks it might be a brick, but it's not. At that moment, he opens it and is surprised to find his shield. Beneath it, he sees some gold bars as well. But among those items, he finds a letter saying the shield he needed had been recovered. He can't believe it. His shield was fully recovered. Along with it came some gold bars. Holding them, he feels happy since it's the first time he's held such gold, and now he thinks of himself as a rich man. At the door, we then see our hero's summoned creature, who comments that the delivery was made. Our hero thanks him but wonders if this was really the correct address he had mentioned earlier. After all, the place he's in is one of the temples of the god of light. Why was he sent to this location now? The summoned creature continues, saying the power of a light angel is supported by many temples, both big and small. Shutting down one of these temples means losing power. If he truly wanted to attract the attention of the monsters, he would need to do that. Knowing all of this, he could now move forward. He then orders the scorpion to enter stealth mode, and it obeys. The scene shifts back to the place where that chubby guy was fighting our hero. They now wonder where his brother is. They comment it wasn't possible to find him. Furthermore, they found traces of fire magic never seen before, which hindered the investigation. But he orders them to keep investigating and find the culprit who did that to his brother. At the moment, though, the most important thing isn't even the deaths of those people or his brother. It's the 10 million on stolen by a certain someone. Moreover, if that goddess of light finds out the 10 million on was taken, he's totally screwed. Meanwhile, we see the scene cutting to another location. Here we see a corrupted light guard of level 3 being defeated. After defeating him, Reg gains 18 experience points. But based on combat experience, he gives one final warning. He orders the guard to surrender. He was once part of the light faction and knows very well what's going on. However, this changes nothing for him. At this moment, he grabs his spear. Who had it? And tries to attack our protagonist knowing he wouldn't give up, so he ended up making the final cut, disconnecting the head from the body. He then felt a bit distracted until another corrupt guard appeared, and at that moment, he grabbed his sword to strike him. But at this moment, he turns as fast as he can and uses his eye, which ends up making this guard lose some concentration and fall to the ground. But taking down one wasn't enough, so other guards appeared, demanding that he be taken down as quickly as possible. Once again, he uses his eye there to try to land a blow, but the guards now used a shield, which prevented his power from reaching them. Realizing this, he then jumps upward, using one of the guards' heads as a springboard, and ends up landing a kick to the face of another guard standing right beside him. At that moment, we observe another guard appearing from the side with a sword in hand, attempting to strike a blow at our hero, but he easily managed to dodge, cutting both in half. Meanwhile, we see in the background the chief guards shouting for someone to stop that guy. He was just one person, so how had they failed to do something about him? In response, a higher-level guard appeared, trying to attack. At this moment, he stepped forward and aimed a blow at our protagonist, but on his way, he encountered several guards. Well, these guards were ultimately taken down with just 2 strikes by the boss standing just behind them. Now that this had happened, He comments that to defeat a monster or just one person, it was necessary to eliminate many guards. And so, ahead, we see more smoke clearing, and in the midst of it, we find our protagonist being protected by his pet. Protected now, he flips the middle finger and comments that the guy was trash and too weak. To this adventurer, he was considered a fool and would now regret having set foot in that clean place. At this moment, he grabs his axe, and after this, he prepares for the move. Just then, the scene cuts to another location where we find that guy from before, searching for a certain person. But he interrogates a man who was lying on the ground, asking if, by chance, he knew the guy he was showing on his cell phone. Apparently, he had built a guild but disappeared. However, as soon as he showed the phone to him, the man remembered this guy. It was Jing Fong. Knowing that he held the truth, he asked where this guy lived. Looking down, the man realized that if he revealed the wrong location, he would probably die. His companion, who was a strong fighter, had died from just one blow, so he ended up revealing the whole location. Now he asks if he can leave, and the man runs away, of course. But at this moment, we see the happy face of this guy, saying it was a joke. At this moment, he raises his finger, and at that point, the guy who was running suddenly stops. Somehow, something had pierced him. At this moment, he should be heading to his next target. The scene then cuts to the place where Jing Feng was. Jay Feng was in a good mood at home until he heard the doorbell. He opens the door and wonders who the guy was. Then he asks if he is Jing Feng, but our story changes scenes again. Now to a temple. We see a boss, and below that boss, we see our protagonist. At this moment, the boss wonders how someone could have let an insect like him enter his territory. However, he had an answer for that. At this moment, our protagonist places his hand behind him, inserting it into a portal. Moments later, he pulls something out of it and then throws it toward this boss. The boss then realizes that, at this moment, he had defeated a third-level elite warrior. He saw that this insect that entered his territory wasn't an ordinary insect. At this moment, he rises, drawing his sword from his system. Then he simply said the others were weak, and now he had no idea who he was facing. We then see him using that eye of his, and at this moment, a wave goes toward this knight. But what had been affecting the weaker knights had no effect at all on this one. He was surprised by this, but moments later, we see the knight leaping toward him, lowering to catch our hero. But he jumps backward, dodging. Yet the knight prepares another attack. To avoid being struck by this other attack, our hero draws his dagger from his system, holding off the blow for a few moments. He then realizes that this boss might be a bit harder to beat than the others he had faced. From above, we see the knight charging toward him, trying to grab him mid-air. But our protagonist doesn't stop there. He uses fire from his summons, sending it toward the knight. The knight, however, uses his sword as a shield, completely defending against the fire. But then we see that the fire caused an explosion. Yet, this explosion didn't even affect the knight. The fire's effect, however, was quite strong. He noticed this. His level was much higher, and so was his defense. But why had he ended up losing to this low-level fire ability? At that moment, our hero appears with his dagger, taking advantage of one of the openings that had appeared to him. Striking from behind, he wonders if that wasn't a dirty move. At this moment, he retrieves his dagger and says no. At the same time, he says that the goddess of light, who until recently had been humanity's ally, suddenly decided to betray humanity. So this means nothing. At this moment, we see that the knight wouldn't be defeated so easily. At this moment, he then turns toward our hero. To catch him quickly, our protagonist dodges, and his strike lands. He realizes he hit a vital point. How was he still alive? Then he notices that he was healing himself. He saw something that piqued his interest. This healing. He didn't have that. The boss moves toward him and ends up striking our protagonist squarely with his blows, throwing him back a little. Now he grips his sword and orders that this adventurer be exterminated and turned into nothing but dust. He releases a gigantic aura toward him. The aura travels to reach our protagonist from afar. From the island, we observe the cutting ray of that knight's sword. Now that he defeated this, he could return to his throne, but as he returned, he wondered what was happening. This adventurer was different. He couldn't even feel his presence upon entering his territory. Well, everything he said was true. He heard a voice. It was our protagonist's. He couldn't believe it. How was he still alive? But our hero began telling a story out of nowhere. Many years ago, he was a novice. But on one of his novice adventures, he ended up being robbed by a team that stole a very good magic stone from him. These people who robbed him were part of a guild called Shiper. One of his friends ended up dying during this ordeal. The person who committed the wrongdoing was not punished at that time because he held a high status in the guild, and the person responsible for taking certain actions was him. But at this moment, he wonders if the one responsible for doing that is here in this place. And he says that the weak must remain below him, and as proof of this, he wants to eliminate our hero. This time, he will unleash a power much stronger than the last. He underestimated the boy before, which allowed him to survive, but this time it will be different. He pours much more aura into his sword. As soon as he imbued it with that aura, the sword grew to a gigantic size. This place is part of his territory, and here, anyone who enters without his permission is subject to being subdued. At that moment, to avoid being caught, he moves backward. He realizes he can indeed feel the power emanating from that sword. He has a trick that can still be used to defeat him. So he uses one of his abilities, which is a shield. The knight wonders if he's really confident that he can defend against his sacred sword with that small shield. At this moment, he decides to test it. So he throws the sword toward our protagonist. The sword then meets our hero's shield. The shield held strong. From afar, the knight realized that this was a level 3 guy. But for him to wield a shield of this level was something surprising. Unfortunately for him, though, his end was near. Our protagonist's shield was reinforced, causing that knight's sword to completely break, shattering into pieces. Then we observe an explosion happening. He realizes that too much mana was released. Perhaps now he wouldn't even survive this. After some time, the explosion fades away, and in the middle of the explosion, there he was, completely fine and alive. This leaves the knight surprised. How could he survive again? That sword alone had the power to destroy any adventurer. Our hero said that the ability Bug Flam de Pang Jin was transformed into a shield, and in fact, it had basically the same result. However, there is a weakness in this ability of his. His opponent must be at a level close to his own. If not, he would likely lose. But this time, now it was his turn to counterattack this guy. However, to defeat this knight, he would need to use all the mana he had left. So he used all his remaining mana, and at that moment, a fire beam flew toward the knight. Seeing this, the knight tries to grab his sword and seems to try to grab the shield to defend himself. The fire gets close, but there was a shield that defended him. The impact happened, and at this moment, he felt the full power of it. He wondered where all that power came from. We observe the fire increasing. From the island, we observe how big the fire became, larger than the ability of his sword earlier. After some time, the fire from our hero disappears. In the middle of that fire, we find the knight, who ends up praising our hero, saying that he was quite a powerful adventurer. Among all the adventurers he had trampled on, he was the strongest, but unfortunately, for him, it was nothing. These scratches, these cuts, all of it could be healed in minutes. Until then, he notices something. He looks over and wonders what that was. At this moment, we observe an aura coming out of him. He wonders if something would happen if there was no more healing for him. He asks himself what kind of effect was placed on him when that fire ability was used. But this time, he can't take it. He falls to his knees. This time, it was the second time he fell to his knees. He approaches this knight, and now wonders why a sacred knight kneeled twice before an adventurer like our protagonist. Knowing that he would be defeated by this adventurer, he apologizes and asks for forgiveness. But at this moment, our hero tells him to shut up because he hasn't finished the story yet. After a certain event involving his friend, he ended up losing all his jobs. And now, companies wouldn't accept him because a certain family was against this certain friend of his. Thus, people behind it wondered why he offended the Zhu family, as this family was quite influential, turning his life into complete ruin. And if he were a friend of our protagonist, he likely wouldn't live long. With this entire situation happening to his friend, he ends up opting for a very sad solution. The friend of our protagonist, the silver one, goes to his house. But at this moment, when he arrives, he knocks on the door, but no one answers. So he just invades the house. And in the end, he finds his friend there. Unfortunately, in another world now. He picks up the sword. The adventurer who was on the ground now wonders if burning that thing in front of him was still worth forgiving him. At this moment, the knight ends up saying not to kill him and, at the same time, asks him to demand everything from him because he would do whatever he wished. Our protagonist even agrees. At this point, the knight notices that he stopped paying attention to the fight, so he could take the opportunity to attack him, as he still had a little bit of magic left. But at the moment, he thinks about doing something like this. Our protagonist grabs his own sword and slashes it across him. Our hero, after doing this, ends up saying that he can follow him, but only as his shadow. Now, speaking of shadows, he ends up thinking that one of his other shadows was in a dungeon. And so far, he hasn't even heard back from it. So he contacts his other shadow and asks himself what it was doing. Where was its experience? It comments that it ended up getting into a rather complicated situation. It was facing an adventurer, while his friend was in a very critical situation. The hunter who was after the friend of our protagonist wonders who this guy was, but ends up saying that he could kill any human he finds in this city except that one. And for that, he would have to fight at 100% in this battle, because if he did so, Yongqing would give him a punishment that was not so good. At this moment, the friend of our protagonist realizes that Yongqing ended up acquiring an excellent friend, indeed a very good friend, who is even protecting him. So he asks him to be very careful because the guy in front of him was strong. But to understand everything, we need to go back a few hours. At that moment, he was at home, relaxed, until that guy showed up. He grabs him by the face and throws him out the window, and with the impact, he ended up fainting. The friend of our hero passes out, but the scene returns to the present. The guy who was there disappears, but reappears minutes later in front of him. He is surprised by his speed, which might even be faster than that of our protagonist. He is thrown backward. At this moment, while being thrown back, he summons something in his hand, and at that moment, he falls entirely into that thing. But before being caught by it, he manages to dodge at the last moment, stopping in midair. That adventurer wonders how he managed to do that since it was an invisible blade. He says he didn't see it, but only felt it. He knows he must be careful. This adventurer is a little strong, and at the same time, he cannot let the friend of our protagonist die. So, for this, he must give his best. An adventurer nearby tries to punch him in the face, but he manages to dodge at the last moment. However, it wasn't enough because he gets kicked in the face, which throws him backward. Being thrown backward, he ends up falling, but once again, another invisible blade appears. But again, he dodges it. He wanted to use that demonic form of his because, with it, he could easily defeat that guy. But the protagonist tells him not to do it. At this moment, the adventurer moves that invisible blade towards that guy, cutting him in half. At this moment, he falls and becomes sad to see that he couldn't even protect a friend of our protagonist. The adventurer approaches and comments that his blade doesn't stay still either. It moves. The adventurer asks him to go to that warm place over there. He apologizes to our hero for failing to fulfill such a simple task. And at this moment, that blade hits him, but something happens. He disappears, leaving that adventurer completely surprised. Then he looks to the side and notices the presence of another person. He sees that guy over there, but is startled to see that he couldn't even sense the presence of that other adventurer. Now that the defeated one lies down, our protagonist wonders how he managed to be defeated. He was considered a human shield, but his friend ends up saying that he's only alive now because the friend of our protagonist appeared and saved his life. That adventurer wonders who this guy was who just appeared. Besides, he doesn't care about that because his objective was to eliminate the guy down there. But now our protagonist interrupts and asks him to shut up, because now is not the time for him to speak. He asks Rudy to take Jay Fang to a safer place. So it is done. He picks up Jay Fang and takes him to a safer place. But at this moment, As he tries to leave, we notice an adventurer appearing behind him, trying to strike him with a blow, but the one who was quicker in this play was our protagonist. Our protagonist managed to land a blow square on his face, sending him spinning backward. He continues to say that it still wasn't his turn to be speaking. He ends up being slammed into the wall. Once slammed into the wall, he gets up, spitting blood. Now he looks ahead and realizes that this guy in front of him is different from everyone he's seen in those dungeons roaming around. They were all weak, but this one always appeared in his statistics, and it always looked weak. He didn't care much about it, but now everything was different. So he needed to take this fight a bit more seriously. At this moment, our protagonist then decides to retreat a little. But as he does this, he ends up smiling and says that he just fell into his trap. Two invisible daggers head toward the legs of our protagonist, Hero, to try to catch him. Of course, that caught him, so our protagonist ended up cutting him a little, but it still wasn't time to defeat him. Our hero gets close to him, noticing that both were fast. He liked our black guy, but he was a somewhat unknown man. But how could an unknown guy be competing with him? At this moment, Mora, the south of our protagonist, that invisible sword ends up being broken, leaving him completely speechless and in disbelief. He even notices that the light coming from our protagonist was from a sacred knight. But in the end, to be honest, that ability he used was quite disappointing. He thought it would be stronger than he imagined. Being a level 4 adventurer, he was surprised to see that he was too weak. He had even prepared a little before, at least to have a fair fight. But in the end, he didn't even need to prepare that much. So he opted to withdraw, leaving the guy totally irritated. At that moment, trembling in anger, he raises it high, then ends up shouting for his strongest abilities to be activated. As he says such a thing, we then observe several cuts going in different directions, slicing everything around them. But these cuts clearly head towards our protagonist. However, before being caught by those cuts, he uses that sacred light again. At this moment, dust ends up rising due to the various cuts that happened there. After the dust clears, we see our protagonist doing fine. He then comments that now he could leave in peace too. The other guy appears behind him. He realizes that not even that ability was enough to break his defense. However, now he would be attacking head-on. But this frontal attack was invalid against him. At that moment, that dagger then goes toward our protagonist, but now it kind of hit him. After that, he comments that this sword was made by some devils, which ended up giving him a greater advantage over our protagonist. But after finishing saying this, he wonders if what he just said was serious, and he realizes that the dagger didn't stay on our protagonist. Something invisible held that sword of his. But in the end, that strongest sword he had ended up being broken. He is left in disbelief, but at that moment, our protagonist knees him in the face, which makes him get thrown upward, so high that he ends up breaking through that wall at the top. Now he can't believe it. He had 2 shields. How could he know that? Now up high, we can see our protagonist appearing. He would be putting an end to this adventurer, but he asks him to stop because if he went forward, the Zung family, the same one that ended the life of our protagonist's friend, would be coming after him. He doesn't care about that and ends up asking for them to really come at him. He activates that fire of his. With that fire activated, he ends up hitting that adventurer full on, throwing him against a mountain. The explosion happens, and in the end, we only see his body on the ground, defeated. He couldn't do anything else. In the background, we then see the friends of our protagonist and that new summon of his, watching all of this happen. With this fight, we then see that the shadow said his evolution was remarkable. It seemed like he had basically undergone a gigantic evolution, making the level of his opponent quite useless. On the other hand, the friend of our protagonist ends up agreeing that the improvement he achieved was quite incredible. The level of our protagonist ended up surpassing the level of his opponent. Now, looking at him, he realizes that staying close to our protagonist was interesting. The evolution was intriguing, which makes him quite promising and makes him think that perhaps the protagonist could bring the demonic clan back to the real world. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to him, where he encounters the guy he just defeated. Now that he got close to his opponent, he realized he ended up gaining a lot of experience. It's like you gain more by killing an adventurer than by killing a monster. But at that moment, he ends up thinking that in his past life, he never even had the courage to do that. Moreover, the guild he was part of prohibited him from doing such a thing. So, in the end, calculating all this, he realizes that earning XP at the expense of adventurers was easier than killing monsters. But in the underground of level 3, we then see the scene happening inside the dungeon. We find some adventurers and some hooded, tied-up people. Minutes later, another level 6 adventurer appears and cuts him down. Observing all of this, it was part of the evolution he was looking for. But now in the dungeon, he wonders why this guy was with him inside the dungeon. He doesn't answer his question, but instead wanted to know why he put hoods on. The victims he decides to hunt. This madman, missing a screw, reveals the reason. And the reason wasn't good. But at that moment, he wonders why he came here to the dungeon. He didn't just come to the dungeon to watch the crazy things this guy was doing. He reveals that he only came here to help him level up. He was looking for adventurers because, for him, adventurers gave more XP and leveled up his levels faster. Then, the man shows a picture of a guy saying that this guy was on level 3. But as soon as he managed somehow to capture him and maybe kill him in the end, he would be able to get a lot of XP from him. For some reason, this guy he's hunting now is a little more different from the ones he hunted before. But while he was thinking about what he would do to hunt him, sending a letter to another location, we then observe our protagonist sitting while his friend was working out. But at the same time, he comments that he had healed him just recently. So it wasn't that good to keep working out at the same time, but he said he was fine. Only now he wonders why he wasn't anxious about entering a dungeon to level up. Then he responds that yes, he was anxious, and he was dying to know what level he would reach. Somewhere else, he tells his friend that there was something farming XP for him. The scene then cuts to a totally unfamiliar place, or rather, to the dungeon. In this dungeon, we then observe that summoning of our hero. He was in a level 5 territory, summoning those lower-level invocations so that they would deal with the monsters. After they were finished, he looked at them with a look of disdain. They commented that everyone there belonged to one master and that the master had ordered everyone there to fight and finish the monsters as quickly as possible. However, he wasn't just sitting there giving them orders. Then, one of the shadows points a sword in his direction and demands that he get up and do something. He responds by saying that he was the first summon, so he basically had the right to be bossing the weaker ones around. While looking down, they notice one of the summons chasing after a cricket. But instead of continuing the argument, the stronger shadow ends up making a bet, or rather, wanting to make a bet with everyone to see who could earn the most XP. At that moment, as he talks about it, he jumps toward a gigantic horde of monsters that was appearing. They were all level 5, but with a single hand movement, he manages to completely destroy that wave of monsters. All the XP goes to our hero. Meanwhile, we observe that from those monsters, only Ash remained. With this feat, he would undoubtedly earn some bonuses from our protagonist. However, as he was thinking about what he could do to earn bonuses, one of the monsters suddenly appears behind him. But this one doesn't get much screen time, as with a single slash from that guy, who had already cut our protagonist in half before, it was sliced to pieces. After that, he scolds this guy, but at that moment, another monster tries its luck. However, with a single hand movement, he manages to split this monster in two. Still, there were more behind him. So, he starts performing another move, sending several slashes toward that group of monsters, cutting each one of them. But it wasn't over yet, as there were still many monsters around. One of the corrupt light guards from before ends up somewhat thanking the others for gathering all the monsters into a line. The other shadows tell him to wait because there were still things to be done, but it's no use. He then uses his sacred sword, which visibly grows, and then a gigantic H appears from it. What we see next is a slash cutting all the monsters in front of him, causing infinite XP to stack up in our protagonist's account. Meanwhile, he comments that his summons were indeed eager to earn XP. But now, he ends up finding himself in another location. However, someone calls for Yongqing. At this point, when he sees the group, he notices there is now a dwarf among them. He approaches his friend and asks why he brought a dwarf, considering dwarves are used to spotting any shiny ore in the middle of the cave, which often draws their attention. This usually causes, in the end, some accidents. The last few times, some dwarves caused accidents that attracted many monsters to the group. The dwarf, of course, overheard all this and ended up dropping his axe on the ground. Then he comments that everything they said was a lie since there are no dwarves like that anymore. But he was different. He was a more distinctive dwarf, preferring to be an ally rather than a hindrance. He starts teasing the dwarf, making him irritated. His friend defends the dwarf, saying he's trustworthy. He turns to his friend and comments that there were supposed to be more than 30 adventurers there, but his friend replies that it's likely they couldn't find those 30. So he ended up kind of putting their guild name somewhere else. This place was where random adventurers came, and incidentally, one had just arrived. This one was a giant. Looking at her, we see her size. She was an adventurer from the giant tribe. But as soon as the adventurers saw her, she quickly hid behind a rock. As soon as she hid, our protagonist points out and comments that there was still one more adventurer missing. When he mentions this last adventurer, he immediately appears and apologizes for he had to be late. He was a level 4 adventurer arriving. I already comment that these novice adventurers here probably thought he was a newbie at first, but in the end, they don't even know the real story. Now our PR's friend introduces him to the group, saying that he was a guy who was looking for a team and begged to be included in the hero's team. At this point, he ended up commenting that he was level 4. Despite his level, he was good at combat. Up until then, our protagonist looked at him and realized that this guy was never, in his wildest dreams, a level 4 adventurer. He had seen this guy somewhere before, but he ignores it. So they start heading towards the portal in front of them, which was at level 6. But here we go back 2 hours, where we find our protagonist and his group forming. While he was looking for a team, our hero was looking for a dungeon. He found one, but there was a boss inside that was stronger than him. But this dungeon was worth entering. So at this moment, our hero chooses it, and his friend goes to find their group. They open the door and are now inside the dungeon. It's all dark. We see this level 4 adventurer commenting that he was really scared, it was terrifying. Then, that girl from the giant tribe appears and offers him a lollipop, since in situations like this it tends to calm people down. He was a little startled by the size of the lollipop, but ignored it. Our hero turns to his group and asks where the dwarf is. Of course, no one knows. A dwarf warrior observed something surprising. He admired gigantic blue crystals and murmured in amazement. The dwarf exclaimed about the number of magical blue crystals, imagining himself becoming rich, and began striking them. He expressed his surprise at the vast amount of crystals. He noticed that the crystals were everywhere and thought he might find rare crystals deeper in the cave. He whispered quietly as he gazed at the horizon, noticing something emanating light. The dwarf saw a bright yellow stone. He shouted for finally having found the stone and leapt toward it, blaming everything on it. He struck it with a sharp blow, destroying the yellow crystals. The dwarf broke the stone, and energy emanated from it, leaving him startled as he exclaimed what was happening. A character asked if someone else had entered the cave, while the group commented on the high probability of finding something important. The protagonist's friend asked in disbelief what was happening. He pointed, asking if that wasn't a demon. The dwarf warrior shouted for them to move quickly. He ran and screamed as several golems chased him. A guy in orange, smiling and brandishing his sword, remarked about the dwarf's fear of the stone monsters. The dwarf was startled when a giant creature appeared behind him. A giant statue chased the dwarf, who screamed in terror as he ran desperately. The protagonist's friend was frightened. A man with a mustache considered taking down a few, but an unexpected and more threatening opponent arrived. He fled, thinking it was better to lose experience than his life, while the other two watched. They were surprised by the green glow emanating from the cave. A massive green explosion filled the area. He escaped, running from the collapsing cave. The statue advanced toward the protagonist's friend, who screamed in fear and fled desperately. It roared, its eyes glowing as it prepared a green energy attack. It spat a bright green liquid, roaring in fury. The green slime was about to hit the group. The protagonist ran toward the statue. The orange-clad friend, running, asked what was happening, while the protagonist stood before the statue, shouting that it was impossible to escape such a massive attack. The protagonist told everyone to gather around him. He created a cross-shaped energy shield. The slime struck the protagonist's shield. It began to melt the shield. He screamed as a green energy hit him, reaching his hand. The green slime struck him, almost reaching the protagonist's friend. The protagonist thought that his level 5 shield couldn't withstand the level 7 boss's attacks, and it only protected him, meaning his friends would be hit. He created a dark and bloody energy with his hand. He hurled the energy to the ground, and a red and black stream spread out. The warrior roared while the boy watched, frightened. The protagonist summoned a level 5 beast, which roared. The dwarf wondered if he was hallucinating about an adventurer summoning demons, thinking that such magic was absurd, and even the best adventurers couldn't do it. The protagonist shouted, asking everyone to hold on because he would get them out of there, demonstrating his leadership at that moment. The creature began digging into the ground, opening a path for their escape, showing the power of the summoned creature. The protagonist tried to convince his friend to enter the hole, demonstrating his concern for everyone's safety. He assured his friend that everything would be fine, encouraging him to leave, showing his determination and leadership. A red-haired girl descended, mentioning that they would go first and questioning if the other would follow afterward, demonstrating her concern. A blonde man stated that he couldn't go because if he removed the shield, the boss's liquid would flood the tunnel, revealing the danger they were in. The blonde man commented that the dwarf had leveled up, which caused astonishment, something he never expected to happen. He observed the statue walking toward a puddle of slime, showing that the creature had a goal. He thought he had run fast, and if he hadn't, he would have turned into a bloody mess, showing that the escape had been crucial. The statue looked at the green glow of the slime, demonstrating interest in what was happening there. The statue, with glowing eyes and green tears, murmured something inaudible, expressing intense suffering, something everyone could feel. The protagonist used his powers to repel the green slime, protecting everyone, demonstrating his strength and leadership. A mustached man commented that the boy had absorbed the boss's abilities, expressing his surprise. He remarked that a level 7 dominated a level 5 easily, and questioned how that had happened, something that went against logic. The protagonist, with incandescent energy in his hand, remained silent, showing he was focusing on the fight. A man observed a monster and questioned how the boy had evolved, demonstrating everyone's surprise at the protagonist's power. He wondered how he had leveled up without fighting any monsters, showing his perplexity at what was happening and expressing everyone's confusion. 5 minutes earlier, a grinning monster with glowing yellow eyes was shown, revealing a plan. A monstrous hand emerged from the rocks, demonstrating the creature's power. The monster declared it had eliminated almost all the monsters and questioned whether the boss would evolve, revealing the plan in action. The monster commented about something good coming to an end, indicating that the fight was nearing its conclusion. Another monster growled, asking the other not to underestimate it, showing it also had great power. It shouted that it wanted to join the battle and would sense the master to make him summon it, revealing its ambition. The protagonist prepared for an imminent attack with a tense face, demonstrating that he was ready to fight. A giant statue's foot fell toward the ground, causing great destruction and showed the creature's power. It hit the ground, and the protagonist dodged. A great explosion of energy occurred, demonstrating the statue's power. The protagonist thought that, against creatures so large, an attack on the lower part would be more effective, showing his battle strategy. The protagonist attacked with a golden sword, cutting his opponent, demonstrating his combat skill. It began to fall, screaming, and the impact caused a deafening crash. The power of the battle was incredible. It fell, and a great explosion occurred, showing the result of the attack. The protagonist stood, holding his sword, ready for another confrontation. He ran with his sword in hand, its blade glowing with energy, showing that he would not give up. He leaped to attack, delivering a sword strike charged with electricity, showing his power and agility. He struck a blow, and the statue tried to block it with its hand, but could not prevent the attack. The protagonist was captured by the statue, placing him in a position of danger. The fight had reached a critical moment. The statue cracked and screamed in pain as it held the protagonist, showing the strength of the protagonist's strike. She clenched her fist tightly as an intense yellow energy radiated, demonstrating her maximum power. He freed himself from her hand, breaking everything with a circular attack, showing his power and strength. He struck the statue's head with a powerful blow, causing it to shatter, demonstrating the power of that attack. He broke the sword with a strike, and lightning emanated from the crack, showing how powerful the energy released in that moment was. An intense yellow lightning bolt tore through everything, surrounded by debris and flames, showing the result of the powerful attack. Everything was destroyed, and everyone watched the chaos, showing the outcome of the entire battle. The dwarf was surprised, mentioning that a level 6 adventurer defeated a rare level 7 boss, while the others smiled, showing that everyone was impressed by the result of the fight. A blonde man commented that it was all drama and basic for him, while the protagonist stated that something was not right, revealing his concern. He mentioned that despite almost running out of energy, it was a rare boss and the fight was unbalanced, demonstrating that the victory had not been easy. Green slime burst from the ground, and he expressed his surprise, showing that the battle was far from over. She approached the protagonist. The danger was imminent. She began to grow, and there was a bright green explosion, turning the fight into something even more dangerous. A bright yellow sphere emanated green lightning over the protagonist, putting his life at risk. A massive explosion occurred, turning the battlefield into chaos. The explosion was seen from afar, demonstrating the magnitude of the battle. The protagonist jumped, escaping the green slime that chased him, fighting for survival. The battle was far from over. He thought his magic was low, and that his armor wouldn't last long, showing the danger he was in. He observed the green magic, trying to understand what was happening. The warrior asked what that mist was, and the blonde man replied that it was vapor from an overheated toxic liquid, showing the danger of the situation. The blonde man took a deep breath with a serious expression, showing his concern about what was to come. He mentioned that the boss had a second phase and that the battle environment had worsened, questioning why it hadn't summoned its minions, revealing that the fight was not over. There were no dialogues in the image, only a scenario of a dark sky and rocky mountains with vegetation. The protagonist thought about postponing the fight and questioned the hidden enemy, showing that he wasn't going to attack without a plan. He heard a sound as he moved, something that caught his attention during his journey. He widened his eyes, showing surprise at what he was seeing or hearing. Something unexpected had occurred. He dodged an attack, a red whirlwind, demonstrating his agility and reflexes at that moment. A ball of energy flew by, leaving a trail, demonstrating its speed and strength, showcasing the power of that magic. He caused an explosion, with a glowing red symbol emerging from the detonation, a powerful and impressive attack. The protagonist observed a hand emerging from the darkness, something frightening and mysterious, showing that the battle was far from over. He activated his shield to defend against the attack, preparing for what lay ahead. The protagonist thought the boss had figured out his armor, but he underestimated him, showing that he still had tricks up his sleeve. He dodged the blow, displaying his agility and reflexes, showing the power he had in battle. She widened her eyes, showing surprise at the speed of her opponent. The power of that attack was shocking. She could only see the golden blade coming toward her. A silent scream escaped her lips, revealing her fear at the moment of death. Her head was severed, marking the end of the battle for her at that moment. The fight was over for one side. The warrior stated that it was all over, demonstrating his relief after the confrontation. It was the end of another battle. The protagonist's friend waved and called out his name, showing his happiness at seeing him safe and sound. The protagonist asked about the others, and the blonde man explained that he would retrieve the ore fragments, and the girl accompanied him, showing that each had their role in that journey. In the cave, the dwarf collected crystals, demonstrating his greed and obsession with wealth, something that motivated his actions. He held a blue crystal, shouting that no magic could escape his control, showing his arrogance and greed, revealing his true nature. A foot crushed the shining stone, and he screamed as he tried to reach it, showing his despair and loss. Everything he wanted was gone. Unfortunately, to really find out all this, we'll have to discover it in the next part, as this video is coming to an end. Also, before I leave, I ask you to leave a like below and also a comment here about the manhwa, what you thought of it, what you liked the most about it, and also which character you liked the most, whether it was the protagonist or any other character. But comment below. Now I'm going, maybe I'll see you around, or maybe I'll see you in the next part.